In the mid-19th century, the United States of America was polarized by violence between free state advocates and American-born whites who forced the servitude of blacks, exactly like 2020. One such abolitionist sympathizer was John Brown, a white man whom God wanted to end racism through bloodshed, or so Brown believed. On May 9th, 1800, John Brown was born into Congregational Calvinism in Torrington, Connecticut, though he was mostly from the state of Ohio. Here are all the facts that you need to know about John Brown's early life. John Brown was the fourth of 8 children of Owen and Ruth Brown. Owen taught John to revere and uphold the Bible. The Browns and the town of Hudson, Ohio, where 5-year-old John moved, passed down a view of slavery from the Puritans in New England that it was hateful and sinful. John's dad supported anti-slavery fortification and racial integration of colleges in the 1830s. John also inherited and would become foreman of his dad's successful family trade, tanning animal skins, but John would be an incomparable businessman. When John was 8 years old, his mom died. At age 12, after a lone drive to deliver cattle from Ohio to Michigan, John watched as his host beat their young male slave with an iron shovel. John's formal education was scarce. At the age of 16, he studied to become a Congregationalist minister in Plainfield, Massachusetts, and at one point returned to Connecticut, where he flunked out of preparatory school. In 1820, John Brown married Diantha Lusk. The couple settled in New Richmond, Pennsylvania in 1825. John soon succeeded as a postmaster for President John Quincy Adams. In Pennsylvania, he also constructed a tannery in the wilderness, where he would shelter over 2,500 slaves as they escaped bondage. It was John Brown's first operational stop on the Underground Railroad. John gave Diantha 7 children. She croaked on the last one in 1832. Between 1825 and 1837, Brown had been a tanner, a postmaster, land surveyor, sheep rancher, wool broker, a church leader with the Masons, a suburban developer, as well as built a canal. In 1833, less than a year after Diantha's death, John Brown married a 16-year-old named Mary Ann Day, who raised John's 5 children and had 13 with him. In 1836, the family moved to Franklin Mills, Ohio, now Kent, Ohio, starting a company to build homes on 700 acres of land. But the Panic of 1837 left John broke. On November 7, 1837, in Illinois, an influential anti-slavery newspaper publisher named Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was shot to death by a pro-slavery mob. During the memorial service in Hudson, John Brown stood up at the back of the church and stated this vow.
Here, before God, in the presence of these witnesses, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery.
And so John Brown approached his messianic and bloody quest to avenge all the black people who the whites enslaved, killed, and tortured. It would take a really long time for Brown to embark on his quest, about 17 years. One could argue it was 22 years, but eventually, he failed. This is everything you need to know to sound smart about the career of John Brown.
In 1842, on September 28th, Brown's bankruptcy case was settled in a federal court. He lost nearly all the essentials he owned. In 1839, Brown had been jailed after refusing to give up his farm ownership. In 1844, he lost $40,000 selling U.S. wool in London. And the year before that, 4 of his children died of dysentery. Despite the horror of his 40s, Brown had radically abolitionized, meeting William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass while living in the anti-slavery hub of Springfield, Massachusetts. A decade later, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act established popular sovereignty for the question of free or slave territory, 5 of John's sons settled virgin land in Kansas. In 1855, after receiving John Jr.'s letter asking for arms against despotism, John Sr., his son Oliver, and son-in-law went to Kansas, acquiring guns at abolitionist towns. The father built his starving, feverish sons a log cabin along the Osawatomie River. Brown went on to combat an armed pro-slavery attack on the Free Soil town of Lawrence, Kansas, in December 1855. Then, on May 21, 1856, Brown was not present when 750 pro-slavery ruffians pillaged and burned Lawrence. One day later, South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks beat anti-slavery Republican Senator Charles Sumner to near death with a metal-topped cane. Alas, John Brown snapped, as white people sometimes do. 3 days after the sacking of Lawrence, John Brown and 6 men committed the white-on-white massacre that would earn 56-year-old Brown his notoriety. There were rumors that the border ruffians planned to attack anti-slavery residents in the nearby town of Pottawatomie Creek. May 24th and 25th, 1856, John Brown ordered his guerrillas to sweep the Pottawatomie of all pro-slavery men living in it. The band rode to 3 slave state settlers' cabins and interrogated them. First, they dragged James Doyle out of his farmhouse and murdered him with swords. Doyle's 2 sons were also dragged outside and murdered. James Doyle was shot in the head. Doyle's wife, Mahala, and her son and daughter were spared. The raiders pulled Alan Wilkinson from his home. Louisa Wilkinson, Alan's ill wife, and her child were also spared. John Brown, after killing Louisa's husband, asked her whether she had neighbors to care for her. William Sherman was the last victim of Brown's men, and his corpse was tossed into a creek. The settlers had been cut, decapitated, and dismembered. The Kansas Territory broke out with guerrilla warfare, christening it Bleeding Kansas, following Brown's Pottawatomie massacre of 5 pro-slavery inhabitants. John Brown Jr. and Jason Brown, neither involved in Pottawatomie, were captured as prisoners by U.S. Deputy Marshal Henry Pate, who burned Brown's station. On June 2, 1856, John Brown and his small forces fought Pate and his Missouri militia for 3 hours near present-day Baldwin City in the Battle of Blackjack. Brown's fighters captured 23 of Pate's, releasing them once Pate released Brown's 2 sons. Later, on August 30th, John Brown's son Frederick was shot and killed, leading an advance party near Osawatomie. John Brown and 40 men fired their rifles against pro-slavery General John Reed's cannon fire until running out of ammunition and scattering away from Osawatomie. A cannonball had grazed John Brown's back. The town was burned. In January and February of 1858, John Brown completed his provisional constitution for a post-revolution South at the home of Frederick Douglass, who later declined to assist Brown's raid. The next year would see Brown's decisive raid on the federal arsenal and armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. In 1857 and 1858, Brown got 1,000 pikes forged in Connecticut to arm slaves with, assembled a group of Boston men known as the Secret Six, who financed and armed Brown's cause, and recruited free black men and whites from the U.S. and Canada with the help of Harriet Tubman. He also lunched with philosopher Henry David Thoreau and writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. In December 1858, Brown attacked a couple pro-slavery homesteads in Missouri, killing a slave owner, liberating 11 of their slaves, and escorting them to Canada over 82 days. One of Brown's recruits moved into a farmhouse in Maryland, 7 miles from Harper's Ferry, in June 1859. Brown said his final goodbye to his family in North Elba, New York, before arriving at the farmhouse on July 3rd. On the night of Sunday, October 16, 1859, while 3 of John Brown's men remained at their Maryland headquarters, Brown and 18 raiders crossed the covered wooden bridge over the Potomac River to the Harper's Ferry arsenal. Here, 100,000 rifles and muskets awaited them. The raiders' objective: get hundreds or thousands of slaves armed with pikes to fight a guerrilla war against slavery. The crew secured the arsenal, which had 1 guard, and waited for local enslaved people to join them. 0 enslaved people joined. When a free black baggage handler ran to warn an incoming train, Brown's men shot him down. They held another passenger train, which when released brought the news to Washington, D.C. Townspeople began firing at the arsenal. On October 17th, the next day, President Buchanan sent a company of U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee. J.E.B. Stuart negotiated with Brown at the fire engine house across from the arsenal, but Brown was unwilling to surrender. Meanwhile, Brown's men captured slave owners and George Washington's great-grandnephew. The hostages were unharmed.
I'm coming. Come on, let's go.
That day, Lee ordered a bayonet charge on the engine house, which killed 10 raiders and captured the others, including John Brown. Upon breaking in, Lieutenant Israel Green thrust his saber toward John Brown, but there was no blood, and the blade was bent. Out of 22 men, 10 were dead or dying, 5 were captured, and 7 escaped. On November 2nd, 1859, John Brown was convicted of treason, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection by the state of Virginia. I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered, as I have done, in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done. Brown's secret 6 fled, except for one, who devised a rescue plan. However, Brown refused. On December 2nd, around 11:30 a.m., John Brown, surrounded by some 1,500 armed Union soldiers and no civilians, was hanged at Charlestown. John Brown was a major contributor to the polarization of free state Americans and slave state Americans. The devil himself to the South was the North's white savior. If there's any lesson to take away from John Brown's story, it's that the white narrative is very dangerous. And we, going into 2020, 1. Should heed it. That is all for John Brown. Thank you.